jump in. You
All
could probably
righty.
jump anytime.
Thank you. Um, Hi, everybody. Glad you could make it. So March is a great month for seeing the gray whales and their babies, and they've already started their northbound migration. So make sure you get out there and um, check out the gray whales. Plus, we're already seeing fin whales and some other summer whales. So hopefully, we'll see uh, a lot more out there these days. The San Diego chapter in April plans to attend and table several Earth Day events. So once we have more information for those events, we will post it on our website, and we'll also be looking for volunteers to help us talk about ACS at those events, and we'll be sending out emails. We'll also be doing some training to help everybody who would be volunteering prepare to just talk about ACS and what we have to offer. In April, we're going to have Dr. Francine Kershaw, who's going to present a new challenge, protecting marine mammals while advancing wind development. For this evening, please mute yourselves and put all your questions in the chat room, and we'll have those addressed by, well, Rick will help narrate the questions, and Regina will hopefully answer them. And then our speaker this evening is Regina Asmutis-Silvia. She's the executive director of North America and the senior biologist for whale and dolphin conservation. She currently sits on federally appointed on the federally appointed Atlantic large whale, Pelagic, Longline, Bottlenose dolphin, and harbor porpoise take reduction teams. And hopefully she can tell us a little bit about that. She holds a master's degree in science and biology from Bridgewater State University. And I understand that she's a walking encyclopedia of whale information and is obsessed with Keith Richards. She's joining us this evening from Massachusetts. So I just want to say thank you, Regina, for staying up late with us. And without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. I am obsessed with Keith Richards, but I don't know how you found that out. But
I'll never tell.
Everyone should be obsessed with Keith Richards. Well, thank you for having me. And I'm going to talk about the take reduction teams and policy as well. So I hope that this is informative and not redundant to things that people are already familiar with. I'm going to share my screen here. And I think basically the message for me in talking about a critically endangered North Atlantic right whales is it takes a village. There's no one particular way of saving these species, and there's lots of different individuals, I don't know why this is, I'm trying to move this, different roles, different ways of approaching this issue, but all of them are in my opinion equally important. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why right whales are important as well. First of all, what is a North Atlantic right whale? So you have right whales off of your coast as well. It's a completely different species. So there are 3 different species of right whales. There's southern right whales, there's North Pacific right whales, and there's North Atlantic right whales, and they are distinct species. So North Atlantic right whales have been designated as endangered under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, but they are now considered to be critically endangered under the IUCN's Red List. Their population estimate right now is only about 360 animals left in the entire world for the species. And of those, fewer than 70 of them are reproductive females. And no offense to any of the guys on the call, but females are the key to saving the species. And so they are the demographic that we most worry about. They were the right whale by name because they were considered to be the right whale to hunt. They were slow, they had lots of baleen, they had lots of oil, they were coastal, they were accessible, and so they've been hunted since the 11th century. And they were hunted to such a low population that in 1935, the International Whaling Commission made a designation that right whales would no longer be hunted. It wouldn't be legal. And they started a slow sort of recovery from that point up until probably, I'd say, like the 1950s. And then there were some issues that were being noticed from things like accidental entanglements and vessel strikes. And then there was another recovery period that came along up until about 2010, and then they went into a precipitous decline, which we'll talk about here as to what happened. They live exclusively along the U.S. East Coast and Canada, so they are a transboundary species. And the biggest threats that are preventing their recovery are from accidental entanglements in fishing gear and vessel strikes. So there's two ways of approaching a lot of recovery problems or looking at species, and it's basically kind of looking at it from the perspective of science, and which I think that from what I was hearing in those preliminary conversations with all of you, that a lot of scientists on here, a lot of understanding of maybe whale behavior. I'm not sure how many people on here are involved in the policy aspect of the work. So science tells you that there's a problem. Science helps to give you those data to recognize that there's something happening. And so we can look at the science and go and understand that, starting in around 2010, we were seeing an increase in that blue line there, which is the rate of serious injuries and mortality. So animals, a serious injury by definition under the National Marine Fisheries Service is that an animal is more likely than not to die of its injuries or of entanglement. So we were seeing this increase in serious injuries and known mortalities. Weren't seeing at the time a huge increase in vessel strikes, but we're seeing entanglement risks starting to sort of increase. So science was telling us that was happening around 2017. Everything kind of hit the fan. So vessel strikes were going up, entanglements were going up, and obviously with that, serious injuries and mortalities. So science informs you, gives you the data, and it informs you of what's happening. But it's actually policy that's going to help you fix those problems. So again, looking at the sort of around 2017, when there was this really big increase in mortalities, there was a hindcast, I guess I would call it, of looking at some of the population data. So these are such a well-studied, well-censused species that it's almost impossible to not find all of them at some point. There are so many aerial surveys that are going on along the coast. There's a massive effort to collect photo ID information. And so there was a possibility of doing something like a hindcast to look at when that population decline really started to happen, and it happened around 2010. So the way I like to think about it is it's almost like if you think about looking at a yearbook, and you can say maybe there was a student in class that was absent one year, but you see them the next year, you know that they're still going to that school. But after a few years of not seeing them in the school pictures, you know that they're not there anymore. So using all of that data, the researchers at the New England Aquarium were able to take that catalog data and say, hey, we got a whole lot of whales missing. And it started around 2010. And then when they're not showing up in the catalog after periods of years, they're presumed dead, and very few of them are quote unquote resurrected. Based on some of the data from the catalog, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the researchers at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center estimated that probably only about a third of the whales that die are detected. So there's lots of whales that are unfortunately getting killed that we never recover those carcasses. We don't have that ability to really attribute a cause of death, but based on the data that are available, it looks like, again, entanglements is the biggest threat that they face, followed by vessel strikes. So again, the science is telling us that there's a problem. When that problem started, what's happening with the population. But policy is what we're using to try and fix the problem. So whale and dolphin conservation engages both in science and in policy, and uses a lot of science from different groups and organizations to try and figure out how we can engage and fix the problems that we're that the science is telling us about. And there isn't, I think one of the things that, you know, whether it's the American Cetacean Society, whether it's Whale and Dolphin Conservation, whether it's the Center for Biological Diversity, I'm trying to think of other groups that might be on the West Coast that are working on some issues there. There's lots of different ways to approach problems, and there isn't a one size fits all way to fix things. So you can do it through legislation, you can do it through regulatory processes. Some groups really sort of gravitate toward litigation. There's campaigns, there's public interest efforts and outreach, and then there's ways to move things from market forces. And I think that with right whales, all of these different approaches have been really invaluable, and they are all being used sort of simultaneously in some respects to try and fix some of the issues that are happening. We know that what the problem is, but we fortunately for us live in a country that actually legally requires that these problems get fixed. And so the way that things work in the United States is that we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which protects all the marine mammals regardless of their status. And that those protections through the MMPA are implemented under the Secretary of Commerce and the National Marine Fisheries Service if it's for the species of pinnipeds, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Things like walruses, sea otters, polar bears, that's executed under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Secretary of Interior. But we also have the Endangered Species Act. And so not all marine mammals are listed on the Endangered Species Act, but those that are have a different avenue of protection through the Endangered Species Act. So we have these two bodies of legislation that say the government requires some level of protection and recovery for these species. And so a lot of the organizations the NGOs that are working on this are really working under one of these two avenues, or in some cases with North Atlantic right whales, both. The way that we are trying to execute protections for right whales is, when it comes to entanglements, is actually under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In some respects, it's actually more protective from that perspective than the Endangered Species Act is. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act actually has a metric in it. So probably didn't know that you had to do math in this presentation, but you're gonna have to do math. So they have a calculation called PBR, which is the potential biological removal. And it's the rate at which animals, regardless of whether they're endangered or not, because this is the MMPA, it's the rate at which the species can sustain harm from human impacts and still recover. And so how many animals can you kill by accident because of human causes and still have that population go back to recover? And for North Atlantic right whales, PBR is 0.7 whales a year. So you can only harm or injure 0.7 right whales a year, seriously injure or kill 0.7 right whales a year on average over a 5-year period, and still expect the species to recover. I've been working on right whale issues for almost, well, actually more than 30 years. There's never been 1 year that I'm aware of in that time that we've ever had right whale PBR below, or right whale takes below PBR. So this is a species that has constantly been impacted by human threats way above whatever this calculation says it can handle. And those threats have consistently been from vessel strikes or entanglements. And so it's obviously a big concern. And for a long time, people have been working on trying to mitigate these issues, but not with, unfortunately, a lot of success. Entanglements are, like I said, the biggest threat that they're currently facing. And the Marine Mammal Protection Act says if the species that you're looking at is over PBR because of fishery bycatch, then you have to have something called a take reduction team. And NOAA, or the National Marine Fisheries Service, will actually create this take reduction team. They put experts on it from conservation organizations, from the fisheries that are involved in it, from researchers, as well as from state and federal agencies. And you're supposed to sit around and come up with a take reduction plan. And that plan is supposed to do something to make sure that you're changing the fishery interactions to a point where the species is below PBR within about a year and a half. And then with a long-term goal of reducing those takes to what's called zero mortality rate goal of 10% of PBR over 5 years. And again, in over 30 years, we've never been able to get the species below PBR. There are, I think, about 60 people on the take reduction team. And it's a good process of getting people together to actually discuss options. It's a terrible process for people to decide what those mitigation measures should be. Imagine trying to sit in this group here and we have to order pizza tonight and we all have to decide on only one kind of pizza. And everybody's going to put their favorite in, and it's going to be really hard to figure out that we're not going to make everybody happy here. But now imagine that your livelihood relies on it. And so you're a fisherman who's, if you have to not fish in an area or change how you fish, and it's going to impact your ability to fish, probably not going to be so happy about making those changes, and you're not going to advocate for them. Most of the seats on the take reduction team are from fishery interests because this is their livelihood that's being impacted. The plans are supposed to be consensus plans. And like I said, I think it would be hard for us to all decide on one kind of pizza. It's really hard to have 60 people in a room who have a significant economic interest as well as conservation interests and scientist interest, trying to come to a consensus on what that plan should say. So there's only been one time in all the years of decades of being on the take reduction team that we've come close to a consensus plan. It's a difficult process, and it has led to some regulatory measures that have been beneficial, but clearly not enough. One of the things that it did lead to was the use of sinking ground line between the traps. So if you are fishing for lobsters or crabs, for instance, you usually set your traps in a trawl. So you have a series of traps on the ocean bottom that are connected by a rope. And it used to be that rope on the bottom was used, the rope that was used was floating line. And so depending on the tide, it would arc up into the water column, sometimes 18 feet or more. And so right whales could get entangled in that line fairly easily. And so a rule did go into place that said, hey, most fishermen, not everybody everywhere, but most have to use sinking ground line to take that arc of fishing, that arc of entanglement risk, I should say, from the fishing line out of the water column. And so that was potentially beneficial, but we still saw the entanglement rates going up, maybe not as precipitously as they had been previously, but it certainly didn't solve the problem. And the problem is how do whales get entangled? And so understanding a little bit more about what is actually happening is really important. And I know that there are entanglement issues on all coasts across the board, and certainly on the West Coast as well. But what we're finding here with most whales, humpbacks and North Atlantic right whales, that we are seeing when they get entangled is that it's this vertical buoy line. So it's this line that goes from the traps that are set on the bottom up to the surface. It is legally required. So they have to fish with it. And this is what's used to mark their gear at the surface. So the National Marine Fisheries Service knows, or the states know, that there's gear at the surface. So it's required to be there. It's also what's used to haul the gear from the ocean bottom. And so it's this line, this vertical buoy line, that whales seem to swim up to, accidentally bump into, and then panic. And once they do that panic, they actually roll into the gear. And so for a long time, we thought that maybe they were pulling against the gear. And so things like weak links might be beneficial. But from what's been seen, looking at the wrapping of how the gear goes around the whale, and some unfortunate cases where entanglements have actually been witnessed, is that the whales tend to roll into the gear and take that path of least resistance. And so they panic, they roll into it. As they roll into it, it actually wraps around them and exacerbates the entanglement. Depending on the situation, it can literally cut into the flesh, it can cut into the bone, it can do tremendous amount of damage. We just recently had a case here of a North Atlantic right whale who is a year and a half old when she got entangled into some gear around her fluke. And as she grew, it actually embedded into her tissue. So they're not just bumping into it and pulling away from it. They're bumping into it, they're rolling into it. And then because of the weight of this gear, oftentimes this gear breaks away, but that line stays around it. And so we're not seeing necessarily anything really in a lot of the cases, it's nothing but the rope itself to be able to identify that this whale got entangled. So we're not necessarily finding whales with a lot of this marker buoy information or with the gear attached to it anymore. They're strong enough to roll into it and break away from this heavy part of the gear as the rope breaks, but the rope itself from that vertical buoy line stays attached to them. And on average, Dr. Michael Moore from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution did an analysis, and on average, it takes, unfortunately, an agonizing 6 months for the whale to die. So it's a really terrible way for them to go from a welfare issue as well. In an effort to try and reduce that vertical line in the water column, the National Marine Fisheries Service implemented some minimum numbers of traps per trawl to try and have longer traps in different areas along the East Coast in different places so that there were theoretically fewer vertical lines in the water. But risk is not just about how many lines you have, it's how many whales you have. So you could have one whale in an area and 100 lines and have the same risk as if you had 100 whales in the area and one line. So the fact that those vertical lines still exist still poses a significant threat to these whales because, as I said, they're not necessarily looking for them. They're not detecting them. When they bump into them, all of a sudden it's when you get that panic and roll. And with a population that is so small, even the impact to one individual is having population level impact. So a few years ago, there was an effort to try and improve gear marking so that now there are regulation measures to say that gear in different states has to be marked differently. Maybe that could help us understand risk a little bit better. Where are these animals getting entangled? And so Maine has purple and green marks, where New Hampshire has yellow and green marks, and in Massachusetts has red and green marks. And so the states all agreed that they would mark their gear in a very specific way for that vertical line. The gear markings are substantially better than they used to be, and they've certainly helped to pinpoint some of the areas of higher risk. In fact, that whale that I was just telling you about that grew into the gear was found to be entangled in lobster gear that was fished in Maine state waters. And so understanding where some of this risk is coming from is really important. And gear marking is never meant to penalize the fishermen. It's meant to provide that science and that data to help to define where risk is and help to learn a little bit more about when and where those areas of risk are so that you can try and maybe fine tune some of those mitigation measures a little bit better. Unfortunately, it's hard to always know that. And so the next step that the current solution that the National Marine Fisheries Service has been employing is just shutting down huge areas of water to the use of those buoy lines. So they're saying this area here, LMA1, this is the Mass Bay restricted area. This is state water restrictions, Great Salt Channel. This is the South Islands restricted area. And so during certain times of the year, February through April here, April through June there, fishermen are not allowed to fish in that area using static vertical lines. So they're not saying you can't fish in there. They're just saying you can't fish in there without that line, but legally you can't fish without that line. So it's kind of a little bit of a weird hamster wheel to say, we're not saying you can't fish in here. You just can't use the vertical line, but legally you have to use the vertical line to be able to fish under your permit. So that's one of the things that we're trying to work on and try and figure out with our partners of like, how do you allow fishing? We know that fishing is really important. It's important to not just to the fishermen themselves, but there's entire coastal communities that are built around fishing. It's an important part of the economy. It's an important part. We talked a little bit earlier before we were talking about whale culture. I mean, certainly fishing culture is an important part of human culture. So where is the win-win? How do we fix this problem? And so that's one of the things that we are working on with our partners right now. And I know that there's also some work going on the West Coast to try and figure this out. How do you allow fishing but reduce the risk? And the risk isn't just if you kill the whale. The risk of entanglements is pretty significant, because what the data are showing is that even if particularly again for females, if a female's been entangled, she's less likely to have kids. So even if she survives that entanglement, her calving rates are going to be far lower than if she wasn't entangled. So it's kind of they're not getting as fat if they've been entangled. Entanglements are a very stressful event in general. So if your body is full of stress and you've got lots and lots of stress hormones, you're not going to be as healthy. You have all kinds of problems with immune systems and reproductive impacts. If you're losing weight, significant amounts of weight, then you're less likely as a mammal to be able to have children. The way I think about it is that, female marathon runners, your body fat triggers a variety of different hormones. And so if your body fat content goes too low, you don't trigger those hormones. And so female marathon runners that have a ridiculously low level of body fat often stop triggering those hormones, and they themselves can't get pregnant. So when you're seeing this in whales, it's very similar to some of the impacts that humans face under stress when their body's in that condition. So you're getting entangled, you're stressed out, you're losing weight, you're not having kids. You're not having kids, the population doesn't recover. And it takes a really long time, particularly for large whales like right whales, because gestation's about 12 months. They're only having one kid at a time. You're not having twins or triplets. So in the calving rates, because of the stress that's happening in right whales, the calving rates are probably should be somewhere between like 3 and 4 years. They're more around 7 to 15 years. So if you're only having one kid every 10, 15 years, it takes a really long time for that population to recover. So trying to figure this out, not just trying to make sure that whales aren't dying in entanglements, but literally aren't getting stressed out from entanglements, is really key to trying to get this population back to recovery. And so that's where some of the public interest and the market forces are coming in, as well as the science. And so we are working with NOAA's Northeast Fisheries Science Center. We're also working with Conservation Law Foundation and International Fund for Animal Welfare and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. It's a collaborative effort to test some innovative fishing gear. And I know that there's some testing happening on the West Coast as well to try and look at something called on-demand fishing. It's also sometimes referred to as ropeless fishing. And basically it allows you to fish without having that vertical line in the water column. And so this is we're going into year 4, 5 of this. We started in 2020. And so I don't know how familiar you all are with on-demand fishing, but here on the left-hand side, this shows the sort of cartoon of what traditional fishing looks like. So you've got that vertical buoy line, like I said, which is now required to mark the gear and to haul the gear. But these solutions here actually either stow the gear on the ocean bottom. So in this pop-up buoy, the line stays on the bottom until the fisherman gets on site to release it. There's also an inflatable bag option where instead of a rope coming up, a bag inflates and brings the entire system up. And then there's a spool option too. So rather than it being stowed inside, there's this little unit here that sort of coils and stows the rope until the fisherman comes up there through an acoustic release, and basically just talks to this unit on the bottom and says, okay, bring that rope up or bring that bag up to the surface. So that static vertical line is absent, and that allows whales to kind of swim around, allows fishing to happen, but really minimizes the risk of any sort of interaction between that line, because the fisherman wouldn't release the gear if a whale was swimming around there, so that line would stay at the bottom or that bag would stay at the bottom. There are different kinds of pop-up gear or on-demand gear. So this pop-up buoy system here, again, usually stows the rope inside the cage. The inflatable bag systems basically have a small dive bottle that's inside. And so that acoustic release triggers the dive bottle to inflate this bag, and that brings it up to the surface. These buoyant spools just sort of wrap it up almost like a sewing spool and keep it on the bottom until the acoustic release says, hey, you can unwind and come to the surface. And then there are timers. And so the timers are honestly not my favorite, because the timers just are programmed to say, bring that gear up to the surface on Tuesday at 2 o'clock. And the reason that I have some concerns about that is because we can't always depend on the weather. And so if Tuesday at 2 o'clock, the weather's really bad and the fishermen can't come out there, that timer's still going to come up to the surface. It certainly reduces the amount of time that vertical lines are in the water, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate them or only make sure that they're coming up when the boat's at the site. So, but it does significantly reduce the amount of risk that's out there. So these are the things that are being tested right now on the East Coast. I know some of the stuff is also being tested on the West Coast to try and figure out with the Dungeness crab fishery, in particular, to try and figure out ways to enable fishing to continue to happen without that risk of entanglement. This is I hope this video plays. This just kind of shows you how this process works. So these blue traps here are the actual traps that get baited, that catch the lobsters in this case. And this yellow trap here doesn't have any bait in it. It actually has the acoustic system in it that then goes to the bottom, and it's that little unit with the floats on it that gets called to the surface. So it goes to the bottom, just like the rest of the traps, but now you don't have that vertical line in the water. And you have an app, because there's an app for everything. So you have a tablet and an app, and that is specific to that particular gear. So you can't haul anybody else's gear. So you call the code to only the gear that you set, and then that float, it releases that surface unit, which releases the rope, and then you bring the gear on. You would just the way you would traditionally to be able to fish. And so then you just reactivate the system after they're through hauling everything. They'll put the rope back in, and then it's ready to go, and they can reset it. And so they're able to go out there, fish, but not have that vertical line of the surface. So this is a particular unit that's made by Edge Tech, and these floats are negatively buoyant, so they always want to come to the surface, but they're sort of locked in place until that acoustic unit says you can unlock, and then it brings everything back up to the surface, and then they continue to fish there just as they would traditionally. They're able to find their gear through digital gear marking, so they can go out and be able to use their app and their tablet and know where they set the gear. So kind of dropping a pin on your phone. You want to know where you were, you just drop the pin and you say, hey, this is where I am. You can drop a pin on the tablet and say, this is where my gear is, so you can be able to go out and find it again. So we are testing this. It has to be done through something called an exempted fishing permit, because as I said, that vertical line is legally required. So the exempted fishing permit, the guys that are using this can only fish with it if they're under the exempted fishing permit. In exchange for being able to fish in these areas that are restricted now, they provide data. So they're being able to provide some feedback on it. And the gear is extremely expensive because it's prototypes. I mean, imagine the first cell phone and trying to buy that. They're still expensive, but they're relatively affordable now because there's payment plans and there's lots and lots of people using them. But imagine the very first computer or the very first cell phone and saying that, you were going to buy one. So they are really expensive. And the way that we're trying to work on that is that we are actually we have grants and some funding to be able to contribute to what's called the Gear Lending Library. So there is a gear lending library that has a collection of units in it that the fishermen can borrow. So if they're part of this process and they're part of this, they go through the training, and they're agreeable to be able to provide that data. They can borrow the gear at no cost to them, and they're able to fish in areas where other people can't fish because they're able to use this gear without the vertical lines on it. And we're seeing a tremendous amount of success. So we started this in 2020. We didn't have a whole lot of people that were like jumping on the bandwagon saying, hey, I want to try this, to be honest with you, because there was a lot of concerns with it. But the success rate was pretty decent. But these 2023 data are actually, it's over 3,000 hauls by the end of 2023. And the success rate's about 90%. And what's remarkable to me to think about this success rate being so high in 2023 was that there were so many new people coming on board, so that they didn't have the same training. and there were so many new prototypes coming on board, and so it wasn't, it was new gear that hadn't really been tested, but the success rate was still staying really, really high. And from the years, the literal decades that I've been working on issues, this is the quickest and most effective success rate of change that I have ever seen in my entire career. And it's really remarkable that in a few years, the advancement in this technology, and I have to say that that is an incredible credit to the fishermen that are using this gear, and the input that they've had in talking directly to the manufacturers about how to improve it under real life situations. And it's also been a testament to the manufacturers that have been responsive to it, and the collaborations between the researchers and the NGOs trying to get the funding and the ability to get this. And it really has been an amazing effort of collaboration between, you know, all the parties, which I don't think that we've seen stakeholder groups often work so functionally as we've had with this. So I really, like I said, and I really do credit the innovation and the just participation of the fishermen who've used this, because there was a lot of reluctance from many of the guys. Once they got their hands on it, they were really eager to try and make it better and make it work for them. Anyway, they said that this is part of the public interest and also marketing or market incentives. Is some of this was also triggered because the Monterey Bay Aquarium red listed lobster on their seafood watch guide, and that caused a lot of concerns. And then there was interest from the industry here of, hey, how do we make lobster palatable to the buyers out there? And so there's actually been a lot of effort now of reaching out to some of the seafood buyers that use Monterey Bay's either Seafood Watch or use some of the other sustainable seafood metrics to be able to say that there is a way to do this. And so everyone from Walmart to Disney to Publix to, you know, different markets have really been sort of interested in saying, hey, we want to be able to sell lobster as a sustainable product. How do we do that and make sure we're doing it safely? So I think it's been a fascinating ride for me, I think, from all the years of working on this stuff to see so many different avenues and so many different people involved in trying to work toward a common solution. So we are going to continue to trial and develop the on-demand systems. We're asking for our exempted collaboratively our fishing permit to allow more fishermen. We're trying to resolve gear conflicts between the mobile and the static fleet, because the mobile gear guys, the trawlers and the dredges that would go out there are looking for those surface buoys saying, hey, you know, we know not to go there because there's gear, but we can't see it on the water anymore. So how do we provide them opportunities to find this gear electronically? We got a grant to be able to try and improve the safety of the gear so that there could be something called a man overboard emergency release button. When guys are fishing, sometimes, unfortunately, thankfully it doesn't happen often, but it does sometimes happen, whereas that gear is coming off the back of the boat, as you saw in the video. A starman or somebody might get their foot caught in it and they get hauled over by mistake. So that you don't want to be all panicking trying to figure out what that code is on your app to pull that gear up. So we're working with a manufacturer to develop an emergency release. So you just hit that panic button basically and be able to get that gear back up to the surface really quickly. So there's a lot of advancements and a lot of effort going in to try and figure out what this win-win is in reducing entanglements. Vessel strikes are a little bit different because the MMPA doesn't have any provisions to deal with vessel strikes specifically under the Endangered Species Act. The way that vessel strikes are sort of sanctioned under the Endangered Species Act is through the prohibition of takes. So under the Endangered Species Act, you're not allowed to harass, harm, pursue, shoot, wound, or kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to do any of those things. So vessel strikes are wounding and killing animals. And so that is prohibited under the Endangered Species Act. It's a violation. It doesn't mean that anybody who accidentally hits an animal should be prosecuted. But it does say to the government, hey, we're not okay with these animals getting run over. So campaigns were really instrumental in trying to get this original vessel strike speed mitigation measure in place. And in 2008, There was a series of areas outside of major ports along the East Coast that required vessels that were over 20 meters, over 65 feet, to go 10 knots or less, because again, using the science, whales had a more than 50% likelihood of surviving the strike if they were hit at a speed of 10 knots or less. And so there were these 10 knot speed restriction areas put along in different areas of the East Coast, which seemed to reduce in vessel strike risk by something around 90%, and it was great up until 2010. And in 2010, there was a significant oceanic regime shift, and we're seeing a lot of warming waters from the climate change. And as the climate shifted here along the East Coast, whales moved into different habitats where these protections didn't exist. And then all of a sudden, we started to see a lot of problems with vessel strikes again. We're also seeing that vessels were under 65 feet were also killing and injuring whales. But if you're under 65 feet and you're hitting a whale, you're not just risking damage to the whale, you're also risking significant damage to you and to your passengers and your crew and your boat. And in one case, a vessel that was under 65 feet hit her mother and calf right whale off of Florida. It's a $1.2 million boat that was completely lost because they were able to get it up on a sandbar, but it was a complete loss just because of the amount of damage. I mean, you think hitting a car or hitting a deer with your car is a bad idea, and you know you're going to have some damage, and you go hit something that's 80,000 pounds with a fiberglass boat doesn't go well. So the risk is not just to whales if you're a smaller vessel, it's also significant risk to the vessel and to the passengers. So regulations are another avenue of trying for NGOs to try and advocate for new regulatory measures to improve conservation. And there was a proposal from the National Marine Fisheries Service to expand the vessel strike speed rule. So in 2012, WDC and our partners petitioned the government to try and improve the speed rule, and then we petitioned again in 2020, and then we petitioned for emergency regs in 2022, and then again in 2023, and we're still waiting for something. So it's I tell my staff all the time that the policy is incredibly important. It has an incredibly important role in long-term conservation, but it takes a really, really long time. There's no instantaneous gratification. And this is not the work that Nat Geo wants to film. Like, you're never going to get famous doing this. Nobody wants to film you sitting in meetings and on computers and petitioning the government for stuff. But this is what makes the difference in hopefully the survival of the species. But that's also where some of those other avenues come into place, like lobbying. So since this proposal came out to expand the speed rule, there's been a lot of activity in Congress. Last year, Joe Manchin and Senator Boozman tried to put some some congressional actions in place to try and prevent any sort of regulations on speed, and groups that are based in DC that have the ability to do lobbying. We're very busy on the Hill trying to talk to staffers about why this was a bad idea. And so there's a whole bunch, like I said, there's a whole bunch of avenues with a whole bunch of people working on this. And so conservation organizations in general have lots of different ways of dealing with things. Those that are involved in lobbying have spent a tremendous amount of time trying to prevent riders and bills that would prohibit any further actions to reduce vessel strikes. So lobbying has become a really important component of trying to protect these species and make sure that right whales have a future. This is unfortunately an example of what the long and winding road to protections looks like, and litigation is not necessarily the first choice in my experience, at any conservation group. Nobody wants to go to court and sue the government, but it is an avenue that is really sometimes important to be able to engage in, because this is what makes things happen. So like I said, with our partners in 2012, we had first petitioned the government to include vessels that were under 20 meters. There was no action taken on that in 2020 after we had more data, again, because it was hard to kind of go back and use that same information from 2012. Unfortunately, there was a number of more cases. In 2020, we had more data, we had more evidence. And so we went back and said, hey, look at these animals have moved into new areas. We're seeing more and more risk from vessels under 20 meters. We want to do something here. So when I say petition, I don't mean a petition where people sign it. It's a legal petition where you go to, file it through a legal channel to officially request that the government take action on something. So we petitioned again in 2020, and we didn't get any sort of response from it. So in 2021, we did go to court and we sued the government. So we went with it with Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of Wildlife and Conservation Law Foundations are our partners on this case. And we went to court and said, you have to do something. Like there's an unreasonable delay. There's lots and lots of animals that are getting hit. Here's all the data and the science, and you haven't done anything. So in 2022, we were told, basically the response from the government on that court case is, hey, we're working on a regulation. We're working on something. Just give us a hot minute to figure this out, but we're going to give you what you want. We're going to have some regulation out there. So we're like, okay, great. We know that you're working on it. That's good to know. But we've got this calving area, and we have these newborns, and we know that mothers and calves spend more time near or at the surface. They are at higher risk of vessel strikes. They are the ones they are the future of the species. Just while you're doing your job to put this regulation together, could you please just put some temporary emergency rules in place in this calving area and protect the most vulnerable parts of the population? So we asked for that in 2022, and the government said, no. We don't have time to put emergency regulations in because we're working on this long-term rule. So they came out and they said, here's our proposal. We're going to expand that rule. So proposing something is different than implementing it. It's sort of, someone can propose to you, but they may not marry you. So it's like, still the contract isn't set. So the proposal went out in 2022, but there's still no marriage. And in 2023, we went back and said, okay, it's been a year. You're still working on this. We're still really worried about these kids in the calving area and the moms that are down there. So we're going to ask you again to please put these emergency rules in there. And they said no again. And so we went back to court in January. And unfortunately, this little calf here just stranded dead just a couple weeks ago. This is Juno's calf. She was the first calf born, or he was the first calf born. This calf was so scavenged by sharks, I'm sorry, when it's stranded, that it's going to take genetic testing to determine if it's the sex on this calf. But this was the first calf born this season, the first one identified in November. In January, showed up with all these propeller scars on its head. The wounds were so severe that they never healed. It did prevent successful nursing. A friend of mine had seen this whale just a week before it stranded dead, and the wounds were, it was about a month of suffering. The wounds opened up and were still bleeding just a week before it died. And it did strand. And unfortunately, it's one of there were 19 calves born this year, only 16 that we think so far have survived. And this one is like I said, a recent stranding that was from a vessel strike. And based on the look at the prop scars of how far apart these wounds are, it was estimated that the boat was somewhere between 35 and 57 feet. So it was a small boat that had done this and cut into the head. So we knew that there was a risk in the calving area, which is why we were asking for emergency regulations. Government said no. We get, unfortunately, vindicated by the fact that we unfortunately have animals that are dying in the calving area. So we went back to court this year and we asked the court to lift the stay. So basically we've just asked that the court, when they proposed the rule, the government said, hey, like, we're proposing a rule, you don't need to sue us anymore. And rather than us say, fine, we're not suing you anymore, we just said, hey, let's just pause this because the proposal is not a marriage. We're going to wait till we actually get to see the rule. So now we're saying, hey, we want to lift this pause. Like this, we don't have the rule yet. It's 2024. We've been asking since 2012, basically. We still don't have anything. So just a week ago, the rule moved from the Department of Commerce to OIRA, basically for review under the Office of Management and Budget. They have up to 90 days to review it. So we'll see if in 90 days it actually comes out. But doesn't, in the past, when rules have been significantly delayed and held up beyond the time frame by which they're supposed to be released, we've gone back to court again and asked the court to intervene and say, hey, there's a specific timeline. They're way beyond it. So we are continuing to try and exploit every avenue that we can to be able to get this rule released so that we can have more protection for right whales. And then the other thing that we're trying to do, and really appreciate this opportunity, is, we really value and understand the value of education and outreach in this. People care about what they understand and they know about. We were just talking about the fact that 10 years ago, we were trying to find ways to just make people even know what a right whale was. And the fact that we're having opportunities to talk about right whales across the coast and across the country is a testament to the fact that these animals people do know about them more. It's the value of education and outreach. We have Delilah here. She's a life-size inflatable right whale that we can take kids inside and teach them literally inside and out about right whales. She's built on the actual dimensions of a female right whale named Delilah, who unfortunately was killed from a vessel strike. And we took her necropsy report and we used all of her measurements and literally rebuilt her to size. So we kind of want to use her legacy as a way to keep the idea of the need for protection for these species. So outreach is really, really extremely important. And, it's fun to go into schools. It's fun to educate young aspiring, hopefully, conservationists and scientists about these animals. But, everybody in the public, I think, is fascinated. My obsession for Keith Richards was appropriate in the beginning. So it's not Keith, but it's a stone still. So we're also trying to make things a little bit more relatable and fun with right whales. We work with the New England Aquarium in whale naming every year and trying to engage people in getting to know who these whales are. So Jagger was a whale that was named recently because the callosity pattern on this whale's lower lips are pretty significant. So big lips. What else would you name it but Jagger? So he's the flagship for this particular right whale, but names also help people relate to the animals and make it easier, honestly, for researchers to be able to go out there and remember who they're looking at as well, and attach personalities. I mean, whales have personalities just like individuals do, so being able to kind of tell their stories in a different way and share those stories is really important. So the communications aspect of this, trying to engage people in the conservation, has been really important as well. And so why does it matter? It matters for a couple of reasons, because it's terrifying to me that, I had started my career as an intern, and then I worked as a whale watch naturalist for a while. And I dreaded going out to see right whales when you could watch them, because they would take 15 to 20-minute dives and for those of you who work on whale watch boats, trying to tell passengers that, like, oh my God, this is the most exciting thing in another 15 minutes when you get to see this whale breathe 3 times and fluke. You're going to wait another 20 minutes and then we're going to go home. Like, it's worth your money and your time. It's awesome because they're so endangered. Like, really, it's worth it. And I remember at the time telling people, like, this is really amazing because they're so endangered. It's really sort of a, it's an opportunity, and it's a privilege to be out here. But at the same time, thinking and telling them, like, this is a species your children or grandchildren may not get to see. And that was at the time really only a half truth, because there was no way in the entire world I dreamed that the species was going to go extinct. And, and now more than 30 years later, I'm scared. I literally am scared that every time I see a right whale could be my last one. And I'm working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and New England Aquarium on their field research, and we're going to be on the water tomorrow. And my view of when we see right whales is amazing, because it's like, even if they're taking 20-minute dives, I really do think, like, what if this is the last time? Like, what if this is the last whale that I get to see that's a right whale? Because the population is so in jeopardy, and it's really scary. And I think it's sort of brings me back to that half truth from a long, long time ago, thinking that there was more of a reality to it than I thought. And we have an obligation. These are human impacts. That means that there's human solutions, and we have an obligation to be able to try and find ways to fix this. And just in the first 6 weeks of 2024, we've had 5 North Atlantic right whales that were reported dead or critically injured. So they're already 4 times over PBR in 6 weeks. You know, we're not going in a great direction here, but it's not hopeless. They're still having kids. You know, they're still doing their job. We just need to do our job. And as far as doing their job, whales have a super, super important job. And this is my favorite thing to talk to kids about, is why whales are important, because they play this really cool role in the ecosystem. Dr. Joe Roman's done some amazing work. He's at the University of Vermont. Dr. Heidi Pearson, we're working with her. She's at the University of Alaska, really trying to quantify what that role is. But we know that whales pooping at the surface is super important to our ability to breathe. And so phytoplankton produces at least half the oxygen on the planet. Phytoplankton can't root into the soil. It's got to sit there in that sunlit, photozone. And so phosphorus and iron and nitrogen has to get brought to them because they don't have roots. And one of the ways that it's brought to them is whales pooping at the surface. So bathroom breaks happen at the surface. You don't poop under pressure. Do whatever you want. You come up there and you bring this amazing, they're literally, whales are these ocean gardeners that bring all these nutrients up to phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are giving you every other breath you take. Phytoplankton are sustaining fish stocks. Phytoplankton are sequestering huge amounts of carbon. So we need phytoplankton. We need phytoplankton to survive. Phytoplankton need whales to survive. And so it's really important from that perspective. When you think about it selfishly, it's not just about whether you like whales or not, you need whales. And so saving whales is incredibly important, and biodiversity is incredibly important. And the loss of right whales in and of themselves, and that loss of biodiversity, can be really devastating. There's some work that's being done by Dr. Craig Smith on the West Coast as well, in the Pacific Northwest. I think he's done some stuff in Hawaii that's been really cool, looking at whale falls. And so if we can stop killing whales by accident, having them wash up and strand, and figuring out why they died, and they're just supposed to be dying of old age and sinking to the bottom, they form these whale falls that are incredibly important bases for tons of biodiversity over decades. As all these animals in the bottom have a different life over that time. And there's a project that he's working on now to try and actually do some underwater video monitoring of a whale fall that we're hoping to be able to help make that happen. And it's really cool to see that those changes over time, and the important role that whales play. And plus, whales are mammals, and they're alive, and they're carbon based, and so the amount of carbon that they take with them in their carcass to the bottom is also really another important way of sequestering carbon. So whether you like them or not, they're super important, and that should be reason enough to want to try and figure out how to save them. So this is what we're doing. We're trying to do lots of stuff. So we're working on accidental entanglements through the take reduction teams, through trying to comment on public proposals, to campaign to improve regulations. And our partners, we're working to find alternative fishing gear, working a lot on demand. We're working on field research efforts. We're petitioning the government. We're litigating. We have voter outreach programs that we're working on with recreational boaters, whale watching, and even the sailing community and sail races. We have a huge amount of education programs that are going on. Much of it focused on right whales, because that is such a critically important species to save, and that is what the NOAA is driving a lot of regulations. And so a lot of our work is very focused on trying to use these avenues to protect right whales. But what can you do? And I think that's one of the questions that you probably get a lot from passengers on the whale watch boats, of like, what do you do? How do I do things? And I think it's important to remind people that you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And that's okay. It's okay. And it's okay not to feel overwhelmed that you can't do everything, and you maybe have to figure out what it is and where your your opportunities lie. So from that perspective, and when you're talking to passengers, when you're trying to give them opportunities to be empowered, voting is super important. I think we're learning that more and more. And so, but whether it's a local election or a national election, find out how your candidate feels about particular issues. Are they going to support some of these initiatives? And that really is going to make a huge difference. Like I said, lobbying is becoming a much more important avenue of trying to manage some of these threats. Donating, you can tell people, obviously, donate to the American Cetacean Society or donate to a group that's doing the work that you want to support. Not every group is doing the same work. Not every group's working on the same issues. Not every group is approaching things the same way. So you want supporters who are really sort of bought into what your mission is and your views are. But it's a really impactful, obviously, way to be able to make a difference, to be part of that team. So donating, I think, is important. Writing and calling elected officials, responding to comment periods. So if you have a legitimate organization that you trust, looking at what they're asking you to do, signing up and responding to those comments can be really helpful. And I would also just something really simple, especially within the world of social media, is just share reliable information. Cannot say how important it is to make sure that it's reliable. There's so much misinformation that gets out there and passed around. So if you feel like you have a group that you trust and you want to share that information, spreading the word and being able to help to support that outreach is really incredibly important. As is correcting misinformation. So silence isn't always golden. And so if you're hearing somebody say something that's inaccurate, even if it's uncomfortable, I'm trying to make sure, like, those one-on-one conversations, like, yeah, I understand that, what we're, I don't know how much of it is a West Coast issue right now. For us on the East Coast, it's a growing and significant issue. There's a lot of misinformation in conjunction with the strandings of large whales and the building of wind lease areas here. And so we're seeing lots and lots of misinformation that everything is attributed to, it's got to be wind. It's got to be wind that did that. We had a fin whale strand that we helped necropsy as part of our stranding program a week ago. And that, unfortunately, that animal had a lot of signs of infectious disease, and she was underweight, and she had parasites. She had a lot of stuff going on with her. But we had a lot of people immediately calling, from concerned citizens and fishing interests, saying it's got to be because of wind. Like, nope. So, just not, sometimes those confrontations are, they feel difficult, but trying to have those conversations to explain to people, this is why ear bones can't easily be, tell you the information that you think you want to hear. This is why necropsies are conducted in the way they are. This is what the results of this necropsy were. It's really important, I think, sometimes to be that voice of reason and correct that misinformation for the people that will listen, because if you don't say anything, then people are assuming sometimes that what you don't say then lends credibility to what they think. And especially if you guys are on whale watch boats and you're dealing with lots of passengers and you're probably getting lots of questions. We do a naturalist workshop for East Coast naturalists here that we'll do next month. And we try really hard to gear a lot of the speakers and a lot of the talks around what those questions that passengers coming up, so that they're able to talk to the passengers and arm them with better information, not just what they might find on social media that may or may not be accurate. So anybody can do any of those things. And I think that, maybe you can't do all of them, but you can do some of them, and they all play a really important role. So that is everybody walked into a bar and worked together to save North Atlantic right whales, because it's not just one person or one avenue or one way of doing it. It really does take a village.
Very good job, Regina. That was very informative. That was very, very interesting. It's a species of whale that obviously we don't have much of an opportunity to see down here in Southern California, but it was fun to hear about. But some of the very similar problems to some of our population. So I have a few questions for you. I started off by asking a question and Pam followed me with a similar kind of question and you answered it in the next couple of slides. So when you look at the chat, the first couple of questions about gear were ultimately answered once we just were patient and waited for you to flip the slide. So thank you for that. I think both of us really appreciated it. Pam also states that she's happy to hear that there are really true humans that are concerned about the marine life of the whales. And I think she's talking that came in about the time of the interaction of the active fishermen. We found that with the porpoise tuna controversy that we had in the 70s, and the answer lied not in the marine mammal biologists, but ultimately in the individuals that were fishing. So, as the biologists, we can give some kind of recommendations, but they need to, and they have the skill set and the history to be able to repeat, to fix that stuff. I had a question about how deep is that where you're dropping the gear?
We've tested it. We actually started our testing with the offshore fishery and have expanded it to the more shallow inshore fishery. I think I'd have to go back and look at the data, but I think one of the deepest sets was in about 650 feet of water.
Okay, 200
But
meters. Okay.
yeah, it might be deeper than that, but that's
Yeah.
one that I can think of right now. And some of the more shallow inshore areas are, anything from 150 to 300 feet. So
That's a significant amount of line that you have in the water, and then to think that there are multiple traps being pulled up associated with that, that's quite, I could see where that would cause the whales a big problem, but it must be really kind of tedious for the fishermen too. Nicole is asking, is there any speculation on how long it will take before the on-demand fishing gear becomes the norm for the
so the
fishing?
like I said, the advancements that have happened since 2020, relatively speaking, to how things have worked with entanglement mitigation in the past have been happening at light speed. But how this gear becomes legal and becomes normal, particularly within the restricted areas, is really we're hoping that within the next 5 years we have a lot of this stuff sort of in place. The big issue right now is interoperability. And so if you think about the fact that you have, I don't know, I'm making this up. I don't actually know what kind of cell phones you have, but like if you have AT&T versus Verizon, versus, I don't know, we have Comcast here or, T-Mobile or whatever you're having. I don't know what the phone companies are anymore. But you should be able to talk to somebody who has a different phone company than you do. And so it shouldn't matter which phone company those towers should be functional, and those phones, even though you're working for or buying from different places, that they can sort of interact and talk. And so that's the interoperability standards need to be set by the government. And so that's one thing that is a big focus of attention right now, of what are those standards, so the manufacturers know, hey, I can sell my product as long as it's meeting this frequency, that it's this range of detection, that it has this ability to be able to pop up in this time frame. And so these standards need to be set by the government so that the manufacturers know to be able to do that. And then there has to be some sort of ability for the way that the on-demand works is that there's you have the gear on the bottom and you have this little tablet. Basically, it's a tablet that presses and sends the acoustic signal down through your hydrophone that's either you put overboard or you have it embedded in your hull. But this all has to be operated through something called a deck box. And so if your deck box software only pulls up your particular manufacturer's gear, but you're the enforcement agent, you can't have 20 deck boxes on your boat and say like, oh, well, it's Verizon, so I have to pick up this phone, and it's AT&T, so I have to pick up this phone. So there needs to be some sort of universal way for, particularly for enforcement, to call all of the phones regardless of who made them. And so that's going to require the manufacturers to sort of work together to say, we're all going to talk the same language, we're going to talk in the same frequency, we're going to be able to be interchangeable, and we're going to be able to I'll show you where we are regardless of who made us, so that cloud-based system of storing that information digitally, it doesn't matter if you're Google or Microsoft, you should be able to go look at it and see it. So that's the stuff that's really the gear itself has made, the physical gear itself has made tremendous amounts of advancement. The gear detection and the interoperability standards and the ability for enforcement to be able to talk to whoever's out there. That's the stuff that is being worked on now and is really sort of the big next hurdle to overcome before this can get legalized. I mean, and I think, you know, it's unfortunate to say this. It's unfortunate to say that this is always what the underlying issue is, but it's always money.
Yeah.
So if you have enough money and resources, there's certainly enough brain power in this world to be able to fix these problems and to come up with a solution. So there is a lot of effort going into that now, and there is a lot more. And I, you know, to just be thankful is, you know, and a positive note is we've seen a lot more collaboration between the manufacturers in wanting to meet these collective goals, and so a lot more working across. You know, imagine AT&T and Verizon working together to try and fix a problem while they're still competing interests. And we're starting to see that a lot more in these meetings. And so I do have hope. You know, it realistically, I would hope within 5 years that some of those things would be issued or resolved. I think, you know, sooner would be better. The sooner the better. But I do see that progress is happening.
Yeah, and that's a great that's a great answer too, by the way. Um, Leanne wants to know, is your East Coast Naturalist program going to be available online? So
Um,
we could
it
snoop in on it, I think is what she's talking.
It is. We're doing it virtually. We started doing it virtually just because of COVID, and certainly have had more participation and ability to have different speakers online. If I put, I'll just put my email in here. If you email me, there's, we have a list you can sign up for the workshop. We don't post it publicly because honestly, we want this to be for people that are involved in whales and naturalists, and not every student who has a homework assignment to do. So we generally, it is like a invite only thing that we don't post on there. So, but if you email me, I'll have them add you to the list. It is on Friday. I know the time frame will be a little bit harder. It's why is my calendar not coming up? It's Friday, April. See if the calendar shows up here somewhere. I stop sharing my screens to deal with my calendar. I think it's Friday, April 26th. I will, but if you email me, I will absolutely double check that. And it's generally, I think we might start a little bit too early for you unless you're super motivated. I think it starts at 8:30 East Coast time and goes to about 4. Yeah, it's Friday, April 26th. And I know we have a talks on entanglements, humpbacks. Trying to think of what the agenda is. I'm sorry, you caught me off guard. But I'm excited. It's going to be a great lineup, and we would absolutely welcome people from the West Coast to be able to join. And we do have, we also have, I don't know if you guys are hearing the same questions from your passengers, but we're certainly the passengers here getting a lot of questions about the orcas in the Mediterranean capsizing boats.
Oh, yeah.
So Dr. Naomi Rhodes is going to give a presentation on some of the theories behind it, and trying to take some of those questions that the passengers get a lot of. We have a presentation on wind as well, and some of those questions that are coming on there. So I'd be happy to share the agenda, and anybody who wants to join we'll definitely add you to the list.
So just for everybody's knowledge, that if you haven't popped open the chat room, Regina just put her email in the chat room. So just down at the bottom of the screen, it says chat with a little dialog box over the top. You just click on that and scroll down. You'll be able to capture that. A couple more final questions, Regina, and that is Nicole's asking that she remembered hearing in a documentary that something like 80% of the North American right whale show signs of entanglement scars. Do you feel that's probably an accurate number? 80%?
It's actually higher than that. It's
Oh,
85,
okay.
86% have been entangled at least once. And I think
Oh my gosh.
I think the recruitment rate beyond that every year is about 12% in addition.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's unfortunately a significant issue.
And then Katrina wants to know how we can keep up to date with all the stuff that you're doing. So is it on your WDC website?
Yeah, I mean, we try, yeah, I don't, we're probably not as great at updating the website, but the e-newsletter is. So if you sign up for the e-newsletter or you go to the social media, they're much better about, we're better about updating that in more real time than maybe the website. But, but I would definitely say that, you know, either on social media or sign up for the e-news, and you'll get pretty regular updates and blasts on what's happening.
Hopefully you're not too spread out on TikTok. So that took a hit today.
I
So.
know, I know.
That's really, otherwise you got some nice kudos in the box that I hope you take a moment to read. And I will pass it back to the president to close this out.
Thank you so much. You know, we had a presentation a couple months ago on the Pacific. I think that's right, the Pacific right whale.
Yep.
And so it does bring, you know, great perspective on, you know, the East Coast happenings. And I will be emailing you to sign up for the naturalist program on the 26th. So thank you very much, and thank you for staying up with us and taking the time to talk to us.
No, thank you for having me, and please feel reach out to if you have any other questions or anything. I'm happy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I am even more pleased that all of our people stayed on throughout the whole presentation.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you, everybody, and have a great week, or I guess a great month, since I won't see them for another month. And then good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a great presentation.
Yes,
I appreciate
absolutely.
it. Thank you.